Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my stream, the Intp stream. I've, you know, been trying in these recent videos to apply myself to more sexier, trendier political, philosophical, ethical, and policy issues because I feel my investigations into philosophy and, as I put it last night to someone, the topical orientation of the channel is a bit scattered. But I'm trying to start a series of efforts to apply myself to a specific topical orientation in law, politics, policy, conflict studies, peace and conflict studies, and hopefully this this attempt to reinvigorate the channel with direction and focus will help it to get more viewers, maybe. Although that's not really my goal. Anyway, so question. Sorry, my microphone fell. How do we create world peace? Right. So this is a common topic we're always debating about, and it's a good question though. Certainly, war is very costly, both to human lives, to environments, to stability of the world, and certainly we would regard war as a necessary evil, unless it depends on who you are. Not everyone would regard war as a necessary evil. They might regard it as a necessary evil, but an evil from which they can derive benefits. For instance, in periods of colonization, the idea is that we have a short-term conflict with these people we're trying to colonize, and which we would define as war. But if we can win the war, then we can plunder the resources there. We can install governments favorable to our interests. We can create amicable trade relations, and we can derive benefits from. We could expend the short-term cost of war and all that it entails to gain economic prosperity in the form of resource acquisition and accumulation and such. And so this was the whole purpose. One of the main purposes of colonization is, you want land because land has resources. And so or maybe you don't necessarily want land, you just want access to the resources. Perhaps you don't have very good relationships with the people on this particular island, let's say, but there's a ton of agricultural resources to generate agricultural GDP, or to get agricultural imports and exports and whatnot. And so, there are various reasons why cunning authorities might want to engage in the to expend resources of both human life and money to colonize a particular area for various reasons. We're not really in the age of colonization anymore, or that type of particular. And the reason for this is because, to the extent that colonization and violent forms of it, and war rendering forms of it, conflict rendering forms of it, were beneficial at one time, we've probably reached a point where power and influence and clout is distributed such that we don't need to engage in this form of colonization or anything like that. And if I were God, the question arises, if I were God, the question arises, how would I make the world peaceful? How would I eliminate war? How would I eliminate violent conflict, which is costly in multiple domains of consideration? So how would I do that? Well, the idea that struck me is that I would create resource dependency. I would create interdependencies between nations and between peoples that would then preclude them from engaging in conflict. And in the sense that if I can trade with you, you have a valuable resource. I can trade with you. I can trade, uh, you know, currency or some other resource. We don't really barter and trade um, anymore. So if I can trade with you, you've got a precious resource that is immensely valuable to my economy, and I can trade with you freely. And in doing so, in a peaceful transaction, I can gain all of the advantages of cooperating with you in the form of valuable resources, the form of valuable imports. If we're locked in what I call resource interdependency, you've got something that I need that I can get from you, and maybe I've got something that you need that you can get from me. We can then trade with each other, and as trade becomes easier with increased technological optimization, increased globalization, we can more freely exchange these resources. But it's even better if I'm dependent upon you for this resource. If I'm dependent upon you for this resource, I really can't get it anywhere else as cheaply. Other places might be farther away. Um, they might be a little bit more primitive, so I can't really exchange with them in a civilized, profitable way. But with you, you've got this this valuable resource that I need, my economy would greatly benefit from, if not need. And and so I can gain benefits from some sort of trade transaction with you, a transactional cooperative trade relationship. If we're resource interdependent upon each other, right? We're dependent upon each other for each other's imports and exports. We're not going to war with each other. We're not going to conflict with each other, at least not violently. Maybe we would in an age of colonization. So here's the thing: in the age of colonization, where this was, humanitarian feelings had not fully developed, and it was just historically more common to try to derive resources through conquest rather than trade. I'm constantly having to weigh, well, conquest is quite costly in terms of my own, in terms of human life, and it's costly in terms of your citizens' lives. It's time consuming. It consumes time. It consumes money. It consumes lives. So at another time when it was more appropriate, more fashionable to have the conquest mentality rather than the trade mentality, I would simply expend the short term, whatever short term funds are needed, costs are needed to conquer you so that I can get the resource that way, which would potentially lead to more net gain for my economy. Because that very act of conquest would then set prices and set a kind of ease and convenience of trade that would benefit me long into the future, just weighing the costs and benefits. One, now it isn't fashionable to engage in such behaviors, although we do it in more covert ways. If you want to believe that 9/11 was, the buildings falling, it was a controlled demolition. And we the reason that we staged this spectacle of terrorism is so that we could then justify going into these countries, democratizing them, globalizing them, in order to get these resources in perhaps a in an area where between two peoples who have not successfully established trade relationships yet, instead of you know so there may have been a benefit there. But this conquest mentality, we still try to, maybe leaders and those in power still try to do this covertly, right? You could view 9/11 as the 9/11 conspiracy theory is that, you know, um, 9/11 conspiracy theory is, something to the extent that government stages this spectacle of terrorism, brings down this building through a controlled demolition, um, so that it could then justify a war on terrorism, which could maybe be viewed as a war of conquest, in order to gain power in regions where there are valuable resources, to ultimately derive extreme economic benefits from that covert conquest. But in any case, where it's possible to trade, the trade mentality is probably far better, because we don't have to expend, we don't have to engage in war and conflict and conquest, all of the costs associated with that. We can simply just um, we can simply just trade with you. And so, but the thing is, if these two peoples, right, one possessing an extremely valuable resource, both parties, both agents in the trade transaction, recognizing the values that each other has to contribute, through the form of trade of imports and exports, in the form of trade of imports and exports, well, then these peoples become resource interdependent. And if they're dependent upon each other, and need to maintain this civil trade network, this civil trade transaction with each other, they won't conflict with each other, because that could endanger loss of that resource, an immediate short-term loss of that resource that we derive through importing from this other country, which would then hurt our economy, right? Because you know, it only goes to say that, um, issues of conflict and war, and these types of political events, these types of cultural political events, do impact the economy. If we're resource interdependent, we rely upon each other for these resources, then we're just going to trade with each other as amicably as possible, as peaceably as possible, if it's mutually beneficial. And we're going to maintain that peaceable uh, network of trade transaction, because our economy, we don't want our country's economies to take any kind of a hit that would result from to take any kind of hit that would naturally result from engaging in conflict. We would much rather avoid any kind of short-term hit to our economies that would come from engaging in conflict, which may even be a long-term hit. Right? There's no guarantee. When you conflict, you offend, and that lasts years. That has a legacy. The offense of just choosing to engage in conflict with each other creates unamicable relationships between countries that do last. And so, if we opt for conflict, the conflict conquest mentality, we potentially not only that results, and because we're resource interdependent, that results in not only a short-term hit to our economies, but very long-term legacy consequences that then impact our economies very much into the long term. And so we want to avoid that, ideally. And so we'll just trade peaceably with each other. The idea is that the more resource interdependent we are, the more peaceably we know how to trade with each other, the more amicable our relationships ultimately then become, and the less likely conflict becomes. Because conflict conquest mentality comes with all of these sometimes even unpredictable catastrophic consequences that would then damage that basic trade network. And if that trade network is damaged, we can't always go to someone else to do it as cheaply, or to do it as peaceably, or as effectively. So we want to preserve this network of trade between us. And the desire, if there's true resource dependency between two nations, then it's much less likely that they're going to conflict with each other, because they would rather go for all of the benefits of a trade mentality than the conquest mentality, the conquest conflict mentality versus the peaceful trade mentality. And so, if I were God and I were asked, well, how am I going to? I'm hovering over the surface of the waters, and I'm looking down on Earth and all of its civilizations and its interdependent, it's independent but interdependent nations and peoples. and I were wondering, well, how am I going to fucking make them more peaceful, right? Because obviously, I mean, I want to. I'm engaging as from in a utilitarian framework. Preservation of human life I regard as a good, and conflict is a direct counter to that. So, how do I reduce violence and conflict between peoples? How do I do that? Make them work together rather than against each other in a violent way. I would encourage globalization. I would encourage trade between nations. I would encourage and strategically make nations resource dependent upon each other. I would make them dependent upon each other. And in that way, if they're dependent upon each other vitally, they won't conflict because they need to maintain peaceable trade between each other. And so this is more of a theory or strategy for creating peace in the world, is to encourage globalized trade, to encourage globalization, to encourage trade between peoples. Because what this ultimately does is create, and we can't just make in every given case, there's so many combinations and permutations. We may be able to do this between the US and China. Maybe there is this vital resource that we exchange between each other, we import and export. That same dynamic may not exist with every other country. For instance, let's take Peru in South America and the United States. If okay, I can get this from Peru, but I can also get it from Uganda, right? Depending on how the geography works out. If we're talking about our natural resources or very different environments. But okay, so it's I can get the resource from Uganda in the short term, right? I can get the resource cheaply, peaceably. I can get whatever economic resource I need into my economy from Uganda, right? Peru's also got it, right? But I'm not resource interdependent with Peru. Um, so I can engage in a conquest conflict strategy with Peru to which to get the benefits of both Peru and Uganda. But this only works if any two nations are truly resource interdependent upon each other, which is not always the case, right? Especially with the United States. The United States is a vast country, right? We have many different geographies contained, many different terrains and environments, and what's the word for it? Biomes within the United States. We've got lumber resources. We can extract lumber from the forestial areas. We have coastal regions where we have various. We talk about offshore drilling. We can get oil if we need it from within the United States. We don't necessarily need to import it from anywhere else. And so especially with the United States, it's difficult for such a vast geography, such a vast terrain of many different biomes that giveth many different kinds of important natural resources. You know, uh, with that much of a population base, able to innovate all the technologies and all the goods that we would get from someone else, with the United States, uh, we we can generate much of our own natural resources and economic resources and whatnot. And so, but regardless of the technicalities and the realities that would make this kind of theory and strategy for peace, more or less good or bad, I guess I would just say that if I had the ability, if I had to propose a theory and strategy for peace, for promoting peace between nations to avoid conflict, to avoid the expense of conflict in both blood and resources, in both blood and money, I'd say promote globalization, promote trade between nations, because overall there's this aggregate effect of creating specific resource interdependencies between nations, which then preclude conflict. Um, because these nations then need to transact with each other peaceably because they rely upon each other for the trade and the importation, exportation of valuable resources. So, yeah, and so that's basically the one theory and strategy for peace. If I could move the pieces of the world around like some sort of chessboard, which this is only hypothetical, I would strategically create resource interdependencies between nations. And because they're then dependent upon each other for resources, they're less likely to conflict because they need to maintain peaceable trade relations so that they can exchange these resources and get the resources that their economy desperately needs. And the economy is the crucial issue here. I mean, countries, for a nation state, your economy is everything. Just in terms of how you objectively measure the quality of life and the performance of a state. And your economy needs to be well lubricated and function very well. And if it, if it doesn't, that's a bad thing. I mean, you can't generate government revenue, you have unemployment, you have economic stratification that causes general instability, it threatens law and order. So, which is interesting. I mean, that's why I need to address poverty next, because poverty is a direct threat to social stability. When you've got a wealth gap and you have, many, many, many poor people that are inadequately taken care of and don't really have the opportunities even to take care of themselves, and you have a wealth class that's much higher, and there's a huge gap between them, that's a direct threat to social stability. Because then it becomes a haves versus the have-nots dynamic, where it just descends into class conflict and class chaos of some sort. So if I were God, as I said, in order to promote peace in the world, I would encourage globalization and trade between nations, and I would strategically make peoples resource dependent is the better word. I would create resource dependency between nations, because if they depend upon each other for vital resources, they're less likely to conflict violently and engage in war between them. Because even if conquest does generate long-term, conquest, and the logic is this: conquest doesn't always necessarily generate acquisition of a resource. You may lose that conflict, right? One, and then you've permanently damaged the trade relationships that can even exist between these two nations because of the memory of that past conflict. That hits your economy in the short term and the long term. The other option is to just engage in, rather than a conquest mentality, engage in a trade mentality in terms of how we acquire, distribute resources between nations and between continents. That's an interesting point. I mean, the word continent sparked a, that's the thing is, that's the thing. Continents themselves. Well, no, I won't really go into that. That's maybe for another video. But in any case, again, what I'm suggesting is that, in the modern age, nations, in order to what I'm suggesting is that in order to promote a strategy and theory for promoting more world peace, for promoting, is to promote globalization and trade, for one thing, between nations. So international trade and globalization in general. But to strategically create resource dependency between nations. Because if two nations, let's say, are resource dependent upon each other, they both need a resource. They both desperately need, their economies both desperately need a resource that the other has, and they don't really have many other options for other nations they can exchange with. Then these two countries are then dependent upon each other for these resources. Since conquest can since a conquest mentality of then taking the resource, going over, killing them, and taking the resource, doesn't always, one can fail and generate long-term negative effects on the trade relationships, through historical memory. And even then, that conquest is extremely costly and is only added to the further costs of then continuing the trade with that nation, right, in the long term. So from just a cost-benefit economic calculation kind of standpoint, conquest mentality of acquiring resource from another people is really not, in a world of peaceable trade relations, for the most part, not a good strategy. One, I mean, even if you're a bigger player militarily, you could lose the conflict and then permanently damage trade relationships, even if there is some sort of substantive treaty that comes in the aftermath that secures that. It's just the benefits of trying to get resources through conquest of other peoples are only unpredictably good. And so there's a mathematics there in terms of a decision tree, if you will, that arises where, okay, yeah, we could go for the conquest option. One, it may not work, we may lose. Our economy with the conquest so one, either way. Okay, so with any kind of conquest, let's lay out the decision tree. With any kind of conquest option, right, for getting a resource from another nation, okay, you've got two problems. One, it may not work. You may lose the conflict. And then, so with any kind of so if you're just going to stage a conflict of some kind in an attempt to get the resource through force, either way, your economy takes a short-term hit. It may not, because you may be able to get the resource you get from them. Because, I mean, conflict implies the destruction of the peaceable trade relations. You may be able to get that resource from other countries, but either way, if you haven't logistically planned far ahead enough, economy is pretty much always going to take a short-term hit, because the nation you're conflicting with, you can't get the resource from anymore. So your economy will likely take the short-term hit anyway. Added to that, the conquest option, that button, may not even work, because you may lose the conflict and then your trade relations are permanently damaged. And you have these long-term legacy effects of, they're not going to trade with me anymore because I'm the bad guy. I'm the bully that tried to use force. So to the extent that we promote world peace, it's about reducing the tendency to I suppose, getting things from each other through force is an immensely costly thing in the short term and potentially in the long term. I think most countries now recognize that. It's also just simply not fashionable to engage in any kind of. That's why probably on 9/11 our country did it covertly, which I don't believe. Look, I get the 9/11 conspiracy thing. I mean, yeah, the buildings could have fallen that way because a bunch of upper levels are falling onto the lower levels, and the building just simply didn't have the integrity to stand it. I get all that. It sounds conspiratorial, but there's a very, very, very good utilitarian logic behind staging the spectacle of terrorism like that, because then you can call it a war of terrorism. Really, it's just a war for resource acquisition. So there are benefits to that, but it's just, but the highlighting point, and the only point that I think really needs to be made here, is that if we want to promote more world peace, less conflict, we just need to become more and more, not totally dependent upon each other, but some level of dependency is actually a good thing. Resource dependency between nations may actually be a good thing aggregately. Because if two peoples are resource dependent upon each other, they're less likely to conflict, because they have to maintain, into the short and long term, peaceable, cheap, lucrative trade relations between each other for the valuable resources that each other has. So this is one way of looking at it. We could tinker with the system a little bit. Obviously, we can't do that, because this assumes that we can play God and then just strategically over time create resource dependency between nations strategically to prevent conflict. But I still think it's an interesting idea. I mean, at the very least, and I don't think that. I think adding perhaps this theory and strategy for peace of resource dependency between nations and arguments for increased globalization and trade, adding that to mutually assured deterrence and other factors that would promote less conflict and more peace, would make for a much more peaceful world, which we're probably moving toward anyway. Just because Yeah. So in any case, hopefully you enjoyed this one. It's a bit longer, but anyway, thank you for watching.